You're all very welcome to this walking tour. Probably the last I'm going to do in a while. I'm going to do my best not to cry, looking at some really dear friends and long-time colleagues here. But you're all really welcome, and I want to thank Stephen, Quinn, Stefan for actually organising this and doing all the tech stuff. It really means a lot. I can only offer you a snapshot of LGBT history. A lot of social history, there'll be some political stuff, there'll be some cultural stuff, might throw in some architectural references as well, but inevitably it's just a snapshot. It's designed to give you a hunger of a history a history and a lived experience that has been buried, that hasn't been woven into our formal historical narratives. We still haven't talked about the AIDS crisis and the devastation it caused to many of our brothers back in the 1980s and early 1990s. You know, we're a couple of years away from the 50th anniversary of LGBT civil rights on the island of Ireland, even though our socialisation and our rituals go back much further. You're going to hear more about that later on. But I'd like to think that something like this walking tour is about empowering us to go out and dig for what I call queer truffles. Go out and look for some of that magic of how we socialise, how we liberated ourselves, how we found our tribes, how we found our sense of self, you know, and how we're still continuing to do that. It's really important. And the monuments that are a testament to that process, many of them have been destroyed, or they've been revamped, or they don't speak to that lived experience. So it is really important that we mark them out, and then we share that information with other people, and also agitate for our history to be actually told, and as I said, woven into our formal historical narratives. It's really about time. So let's go time traveling. There's a number of reasons why I brought you here, and the first one is a reference to St. Patrick, who would have actually, or he's allegedly baptised people at a well on the site of St. Patrick's Cathedral. It's to St. Patrick we go to for the first attested written reference to same-sex desire in Irish literature. And I love the fact it's the holy man of Ireland. It's his autobiography written in the 5th century. And he would have been a sort of handsome, I'd imagine a handsome Roman Welsh, educated Roman Welsh guy. He's trying to hitch a lift back to Wales. Late 5th century, really dangerous crossing. There's little small open boats. Again, this is before the Vikings. And he describes going up to the captain of the boat and the captain refusing him. And all the while there's two sailors standing looking at him, and they lean over to St. Patrick and say, come and make friends with us in whatever way you want. St. Patrick's a little bit sort of thrown by this. But he's all about getting the lift. The captain refuses, so he comes back later that afternoon and badgers the captain to give him a lift, a spin back to Wales. Captain relents. Later on, he describes going back up to the two sailor boys to actually ask them what they meant by that phrase, come and make friends with us in whatever way you will. And the two sailor boys replied, come and suckle our breasts. Now, I'm not paraphrasing, that's the actual quote, translated from Latin and Irish, come and suckle our breasts. Now, apart from the fact it's a very blatant sort of come on by clearly two randy sailors who wanted to have a trio with St. Patrick. But what's really interesting about it, I mean, the reference itself is fascinating, but what's really interesting is the spin that was put on it by cultural anthropologists and social historians in decades and centuries later. And rather than admit what was actually self-evident, as I said, two horny sailor boys being boys and trying to do the come on St. Patrick, that was dismissed. The reality of that come on was dismissed, and it was recoded as a Celtic friendship ritual. As if, you know, every Irish man when they met each other went up and actually said, give us a lick of your tits. But you know, the dismissal of some clear evidence about same-sex desire being called out there is indicative of how LGBT history was buried, marginalised, made invisible. In 1884, there was what was called the Dublin Castle sex scandals. Again, the reason why we're here. William Smith O'Brien decided, I mean, he was an ultra-right nationalist, decided to libel some of the British administrators and some of the Anglo-Irish administrators working in Dublin Castle at the time, libelled them as homosexuals. And all he was doing was just simply, it was grounded in nothing but crude anti-Irish sentiment, that's all. He libelled them, and not unlike what happened to happen to Oscar Wilde 10 years later, what was deposited in court represents the first attested reference to a gay male subculture in modern urban Ireland. Now you can imagine when all of this evidence was actually deposited and presented, uproar ensued. The papers had a field day with it, both in Dublin and in London. Polite society was outraged, and it actually pushed the government in Westminster a year later to introduce another piece of really egregious legislation called the Criminal Law Amendment Act. Now I want to keep you this in mind. So we have the Offence Against the Person Act, 10 years in prison with hard labour for intercourse, but the Criminal Law Amendment Act went one step further, again informed by the salaciousness of and the outrage caused by the Dublin Castle sex scandals. The Criminal Law Amendment Act outlawed any form of intimacy between men, in public or in private. Know what the Irish Crown jewels are? Now they're not some sort of drag queens, sort of paste jewellery. The Irish Crown jewels are some sex toys. The Irish Crown jewels were a sort of more modest collection version of the English Crown jewels. There was an enormous, gorgeous sort of embellished collar that had rubies and emeralds and diamonds, and then a large sort of ceremonial collar, the collar of St. Patrick, and then a sort of huge brooch as well, and some other little bits and pieces. They were kept in a safe in the tower behind us by Sir Arthur Vickers, 43-year-old guy, allegedly homosexual. He's one of only two people with a key. And a week before the state visit of King Edward VII and his Queen, the jewels go missing. The government in London, you can imagine, like the jewels would have been used for the viceroy or the monarch's representative at things like formal balls and investitures and everything else. And here's the king arriving. He would have actually worn them himself during formal functions here, and they've disappeared. Bit of a scandal. The government in London sets up a royal commission to investigate it. It doesn't get very far because it's actually locked down almost as quickly as it's set up. And there was a later suspicion that the reason why it was locked down was because individuals, both in the British royal family and the British government of the day, were worried for where it might lead, and would actually point the finger at some members of Parliament and members of the royal family who might have been gay. So the story disappeared, the commission disappeared, and nothing was heard of the jewels again. Sir Arthur Vickers was sacked from his job. When he came to court, he discovered that he'd been living with the younger brother of Ernest Shackleton, the explorer of the Antarctic, Francis Shackleton, who was described as a bit of a rake by the newspapers of the day. This is 1907. He was actually fingered by Sir Arthur Vickers. Sorry, wrong language. He was actually blamed. He was blamed, but they might have actually been fingering each other. He was blamed. Sir Arthur Vickers actually pointed a finger of blame on Francis Shackleton, and actually Francis Shackleton maintained that Sir Arthur Vickers was actually responsible for it. Shackleton actually disappeared with his tail between his legs to England, and there was just such a kerfuffle about it afterwards. He moved on to the continent. Arthur Vickers actually was sacked from his job, and he went down, he would have been Anglo-Irish, went down to the family home in Kerry, and during the War of Independence, not long after, 15 years later, the IRA took him outside his house and made him watch it being burnt to the ground, and then they shot him in the head. I have a theory about what happened to the jewels. I mean, you must be curious, you know. They would be valued by about, they would be valued about 3.5 million in today's money, okay? But I sort of just thought about it. Okay, so Arthur Vickers, he's one of only 2 people with a key. He's got a bit of a drink problem. So here's the kicker. It's 1907. People have telephones. Governments have telephones. It's Friday, the end of a hectic week. He's phoning some of his gayer friends going, fancy a glass of sherry up in the tower? A few of his friends rock up on a Friday evening, bit of a party, somewhere late as they're all getting scaldy and late on Friday evening. He turns around to the friends and say, there could be civil servants as well. Do you fancy actually, do you want to see the Irish Crown Jewels? And everyone, of course, immediately, what would you all do? Yes, take them out! And of course, in between having your third or fourth sherry, going, let me try them on! Poor Arthur then falls asleep, okay, knocks himself out, wakes up later that night, finds the safe door open, and the jewels have disappeared, and of course, never heard about it again. That's my theory, anyway. You can actually hear more about the story if you log onto the Irish Queer Archive Insta page or the Facebook page. So we're outside the Mercantile, which is the site of Sides Dance Club. It was the first commercial dance club in Ireland, on the island of Ireland actually. It opened on St. Bridget's Day in 1984. It was set up by John Noel, who would later actually die of AIDS complications in Kerryman. John Noel died of AIDS complications. John set this up with some silent money from Cyril O'Brien. And Cyril O'Brien, another Kerryman, had made his money on a gay sauna called The Gym. We passed it the other end of Dame Lane. He made his money with a gay sauna called The Gym that used to engage in a sort of cat and mouse game with the police because, of course, it screened pornography. It was essentially could have been done under Victorian Bawdy House legislation. You know, men are paying in to have consensual sex with each other. It's still illegal, even if it's consensual. And again, not just because there's a financial transaction, but for reasons I mentioned down in Dublin Castle, it's still criminal. But Cyril made a wad of cash from the Gym. And took a punt on John's idea for a New York-inspired dance club here, which I'll go back and reference in a moment. A year after, actually the same year he opened up, he helped sponsor Finance Sides. He bought an old geezer's bar, the George there, that Georgian building that we see at the end of the street, the corner of Dame Lane, George Street, an old geezer's bar, and set up a very 80s, this is the summer of 84, very 80s mirrors and chrome, a tiny mirrors and chrome bar on the first floor of the George, which is now I think the green room of the George. I mean, it's a tiny space. You could fit about 20 or 30 people. There was a wonderful trompe l'oeil painted by a fabulous clone called Oliver Stanley. He was also wonderful, designed some great gay and lesbian publications of the time. He would also later die of AIDS. Wonderful trompe l'oeil, a very Tom of Finland of a bunch of very fit blokes in skin-tight leather and jeans playing pool, and this was the entire ceiling. It should have actually been preserved. It's quite extraordinary that it was painted over. The bar was tiny. In fact, you went in there. One night I was in there and I was trying to scope somebody through. There's loads of mirrors and everything, and like lots of flashlights. It was the mid-80s and lots of black light. And I was trying to scope a couple of people down at the end through these mirrors, and then it dawned on me that I was getting sort of various oblique reflections of myself and the 2 guys I was actually standing with. The Loft, as it was called, David Norris, Centre David Norris once described it as looking like the inside of a hairdresser's brain. It was just so busy, but it was an instant. It was very 80s. It was very much of its time. It felt modern. It felt chic, and it also spoke to this pent-up demand from gay men and lesbian women for public social spaces. So when within a year he'd moved downstairs, kicked all the old geezers out, and had taken over the lower bar, and then progressively over the second half of the 80s and into the 90s would extend further up the street. The George, of course, is our longest running gay bar. But back to Sides, when it opened, there was nothing like it in Ireland. There'd been the Hirschfeld Centre Flickers, which was Ireland's first gay bar, and the first attempt at, it was community run, but it was run on commercial grounds, but it was community, it had a community ethos. It was professionally run because it was the cash cow of the building. Again, I'll talk about that, we're going to go down there shortly. But when Sides opened, there was nothing like it. Your typical dance club at the time, or disco, like Zhivago's on Baggot Street, which is now Tesco's. I mean, Zhivago's used to brand themselves on the side of Dublin bus, and you think like any dance club that needs to brand itself, where love stories begin, research Stefan. Like, if you need to brand yourself in the Dublin bus, you don't have any cred to start with, okay? And the typical sort of dance club of the time was a small black painted wall with some chrome, dodgy sticky carpet, selling warm overpriced wine. Alcohol, beers only arrived in dance clubs here in 1991. But the club was everything. Very New York inspired, white walls, 3 big terror strokes on the wall, lights running vertically down the wall, and then parkans, sort of stage lighting buried into the stage, because they used to do live gigs, that would create washes of colour, a little bit sort of like Close Encounters of the Third Kind, you know, the sort of washes that create then shadows behind you, washes across the floor, and then sort of banquet seating, modular banquet seating that could be rearranged as risers for people to dance to, or stood up to break up space where people could put their drinks on or whatever. And not only was it Ireland's first commercial dance club, but it has an iconic status in Irish club history, because it was essentially Ireland's first commercial mixed dance club. The reason why we're briefly stopping outside this former central bank is because this was the site of the Dublin Pride rally in 1993. 2 days after the government, with immaculate timing, 2 days after the government repealed all of that odious legislation I mentioned earlier on. The 1993 march had grown from 10 years earlier, where there was 150 of us marched from following the Declan Flynn murder and the Fairview Park march, but 150 people from Cork, Dublin, Belfast, Galway marched from St Stephen's Green down to the GPO, stood outside the GPO, but you can imagine it was really chaotic. There were no stewards or anything, marshals, police were sort of standing around, a bit bemused by this raggle-taggle group of people, and 3 of us made speeches, but the most outstanding contribution was from Ireland's most publicly visible lesbian, Joni Crone, who'd come out on the Late Late Show on national television 3 years prior, and she actually rendered a queer declaration of the Republic that she actually read from the reviewing stand, and then renamed the GPO the Gay Persons Organisation. Jump forward 10 years later, of course, as you can imagine, as we've seen the last few years, the Pride marches have grown and grown and grown. They fizzled out for a little while in the late 80s, then they were reinstated in 90s. Pride continued all the time, Pride Week, the celebrations and cultural events, but the parade, there simply weren't enough numbers for the parade. By 1993, there was about 1,000 people on the parade. It was the first time you get a hint of sort of the taste for fetish and kink and leather that would actually become fairly sort of standard on Pride parades much later on. But the rally ended up here. It sort of ran around Dublin 2 and ended up here. And it was before they railed off Central Bank Plaza, so we were able to use all of the steps. There's a wonderful moment as we're just coming up to the plaza and everyone's screaming, "What do we want? Gay rights! When do we get them? Yesterday!" One of Dublin's most famous street performers, the Diceman Tom McGinty, who would later die of AIDS complications as well, was dressed as a convict with a big sort of polystyrene ball and chain, symboling the sort of chip ball of oppression, and then got somebody to sort of cut it off in a sort of elaborate ritual, and then stripped his convict uniform off down to a little pair of leather jockstrap, and then actually ripped that off as well, just to go, yes, I'm here. It was a really extraordinary moment, and what was lovely about that period is Mary Robinson, who was president of Ireland at the time, had been David Norris's senior counsel. Not only was she a sponsor and supporter of the Hirschfeld Centre, along with people like Dr. Mary McAleese and a former Minister for Health, Dr. Noel Brown, one of the few Labour Party reps who were, and one of the few political reps at the time who were proactive in their support of both law reform and quality legislation, just general support for an embattled community. Mary Robinson had the joy, and it must have been really wonderful. Here's a woman who fought 11 years, not only professionally, but also politically, to actually reform the legislation. And it's down to her to actually sign into law, a week after Pride Week, sign into law the new Sexual Offences Act that introduced an equal consent, age of consent for men, women, hetero and homo in Ireland, long before actually Britain reformed their legislation. So when this opened, as I said, it was one of the earliest of its kind in the world in terms of its comprehensive nature. It had offices on the top floor, it had a cafe, later on a bar, but that was much later on. It had a library, a women's group called Liberate Irish Lesbians. They had the place to themselves on Thursday night, exclusively women, at a time when they needed to have their own space. It had a youth group, the first lesbian gay youth group of its time in Ireland. And at a time when any discussion of youth sexuality in general was a no-no. So the building was a home from home for dislocated lesbians and gay men. It was a default to a non-existent commercial scene, and it was also a politicizing space. It was called the Hirschfeld Centre after Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld. He was a gay Jewish German doctor, and he's one of the world's earliest gay activists. He's the guy who coined the word in the 1910s, coined the word transvesticism, where he made a distinction, because up until that point, people considered that transvesticism was sort of wrapped up in homosexuality, and male homosexuality, that was somehow some sort of third sex. So it was really important to name the place the Hirschfeld Centre, to call the dance club Flickers, pejorative word. It also had a bit of a 70s disco ring to it as well, you know. It ran for 9 years. I'm not going to idealise it. I went in there when I was 19, and I came out when I was 29. And I think it was the making of me, both as a man and as an activist. And it allowed a load of us. It allowed thousands of lesbians and gay men to find themselves, to find their tribes. It was instrumental in actually culturing a sense of community and politicizing people remarkably through the social medium. And you know, you look around Irish society today, the results are self-evident, the success of this building. It went through a couple of down periods as well, you know, and I'd be the first person to actually critique some of the things it did wrong. Excuse me. But there's no denying its iconic status in Irish LGBT history. Sorry, it was I'm getting a bit emotional now, but it was torched 4 days after the Halloween Ball, which was the high point of the LGBT social calendar. We had a Halloween Ball here on the 31st of October until 7 o'clock in the morning. All the big events would run late, and there'd be free coffee and croissants afterwards for the diehards. You'd often have anything from like 50 to 200 people hanging about. The building was torched. At a stroke, it cut off access to social life in Dublin. It also, as you'll see, it would be another 10 years before Outhouse would open first of all in South William Street, and then later at its current address in Capel Street. It set back the development of a community centre just at a time when there was this extraordinary political and cultural and social flourishing happening. And just as, you know, mainstream society was, you know, slowly getting on board with our needs and concerns. I just want to stop very briefly outside the ARC, the Irish Cultural Centre. It's actually a 10 or 11-year-old boy is on board. It's this rainbow thread was actually installed during Pride a couple of years ago, when the national LGBT youth strategy was launched from here, actually from the stage on the back of the centre in Meeting House Square, launched to great fanfare and acclaim. As a result, it was launched by Dr. Catherine Saboni, the former Minister for Family and Children. I just want to quickly say that the National Youth LGBT Youth Strategy was the result of some significant discourse around the country. It's considered the world's first of its kind. It involved a massive conversation over several years. It was chaired by Irish Times journalist and proud lesbian feminist Una Mullally, driven by the department, and it involved conversations with upwards of 2,000 LGBT youth, statutory organisations, community groups, and non-governmental organisations, and they wove all of those discussions and research into a set of recommendations and proposals that were distilled towards advancing the desires, the needs, the wants, and also addressing the fears of LGBT youth. It's a remarkable document. It's up online, and I recommend reading it. Lots of it still needs to be implemented. I want to go back a little bit in time, because it was set up by a bunch of people who were really progressive minds in terms of creating a space, not unlike another one that exists on the north side of the city called the Grapevine Arts Centre. The Project Arts Centre had a group of people that also included two brothers, Peter and Jim Sheridan. Peter, playwright; Jim Sheridan, also playwright, mainly for film director as well. And they really wanted to do exactly what the place is doing today. Essentially platform socially aware, progressive work that was simply not given its voice in other venues around town. I mean, the Communist Party of Ireland bookshop, theatre, the new theatre next door, was actually one of the few places in the 70s and 80s that would actually facilitate, say, lesbian gay theatre, watching lesbian gay theatre exist, or performances, or even meeting spaces, large-scale meeting places that simply couldn't be accommodated by somewhere like the Hirschfeld Centre. In 1976, the government banned gay news, as I mentioned earlier on. Gay news had been set up in the London School of Economics in the early 80s, and it was set up by a group of people to facilitate the burgeoning demand for news on the unfolding gay liberation movement in Britain. I wanted to keep in mind that banning because a year later the project decided to put on Gay Sweatshop, which was an educational theatre group from London. They're going to come over here and do two plays, Mr. X, which spoke to the lived experience of gay men, and Any Woman Can, which spoke to lesbian experience. They had been touring England. Word got out that they were coming over here, and a couple of arch-conservative Fianna Fáil city councillors had a meltdown. Now, funny enough, I'm going to spare you some of the detail because there's loads of information about this case. But basically, without having, it's typical of lots of attempts at censorship, without having seen the show, I mean, I don't think the show had even opened at this stage, but they just decided that, it wasn't fit for purpose, and attempted to take away the project's annual grant of £6,000, an enormous amount of money in 1977. Now, the Irish Lesbian Gay Civil Rights Movement is, at that point, it's 3 years old, and it's ready for a fight. And immediately what happens, the troops are rallied, there's petitions made to Dublin City Council, there's a petition out here trying to get public support for it. to actually bolster them, to make sure that the shows actually go on. And you know what happens with any form of censorship? You know, ultimately puts bums on seats. But there's some choice quotes from mainstream media at the time, and there's one from the chairman of the Knights of Columbanus. The Knights of Columbanus were a little bit like the ancient order of Hibernians, which were this alt-right, arch-conservative religious, and we're talking about Roman Catholic, religious group in New York that were responsible for banning representation of lesbians, gay men in St. Patrick's Day parade for ages because they didn't think it accorded with notions, very sort of ancient notions of Irish cultural identity. But the Knights of Columbanus, the quote from the chairman is really instructive at the time, and you see this posturing being used time and time again. And he said something to the effect, again, I don't have my notes, but I'm quoting from a report in the Irish Times, where he said something to the effect was like, you know, it's the Project Art Centre, and again, without having seen the show, it's wonderful that the Project Art Centre does all this stuff, but isn't it a shame that it has to muddy it by making homosexuality look normal? Or words to that effect, should look normal. There's also some really choice quotes from the team behind Gay Sweatshop, who actually described their trip to Ireland as one of going to a backward conservative country, and they actually opined that it was worse for heterosexuals than it was for homosexuals. I mean, you think at the time, divorce was illegal, abortion was illegal, contraception was illegal. At the time, it was legal for a man to actually rape his wife. We're talking about the 70s. A woman, when she got married, had to give up her job. She had to get the permission from her husband to actually open up a bank account. You know, so actually, talk about the Taliban, it's not that far removed. But yeah, some really good things came out of that. I mean, inevitably, Dublin City Council got back to actually supporting the venue. And needless to say, as any one of you who's used this place know, there's been some terrific stuff. They've continued with that programme of giving a space to marginalised voices of various kinds. The Turks Head, which is on the corner of Essex Street and Parliament Street, used to be known as the Parliament Inn. It was one of Ireland's first progressive gay bars when it opened in the early 80s. 3 floors. They used to have a monthly kink leather night. On one floor they had, from late 1980 onwards, they had a lesbian night called Sita's, and it worked throughout the 80s as a gay bar. Did get into a couple of problems in the 90s when they actually refused to stop GCN, and GCN actually mounted a picket on it. That put some manners on it very quickly. And it's also actually a venue where the Friends of Eon, Ireland's first trans group, which was founded in 1977, was very underground and would remain so for years. But the Friends of Eon organised Ireland's first trans social night called Lola's, and it ran for almost 20 years in the Parliament Inn. We're passing the back of the Olympia Theatre, which was the mothership for Alternative Ireland. Sadly missed St. Patrick's weekend piece of debauchery that was also, at a time when government was ignoring our needs, was a singular piece of funding once a year for HIV funding, but also HIV consciousness raising, at a time when government simply didn't step up to the mark. I mean, it's actually quite extraordinary. It says something that it was 5 years after the first documented cases of AIDS in Ireland in the early 80s. It took 5 years for the government to have a conversation in the Dáil chamber. And they really, I would cynically say, there's some truth to it, the only reason they actually got up to speed was because it had started to spread out into mainstream society. It was no longer just the innocents were now infected. It was no longer just sort of inner city, marginalised inner city, IV drug using communities and gay men. But don't get me started on that. by the way. So Brogan's here used to be called the Viking, and it's the site of Dublin and Ireland's first gay bar. People used to call this the pink triangle. Between sides, the George, the Hirschfeld Centre, the Parliament, yeah. This was like a pink triangle. Tells you how lazy the faggots and dykes are. After marriage equality, people said, and after Gender Recognition Act, people said, well, the LGBT people, not at all. You've got your rights. What else do you need? Why do you need to keep banging on? But don't see our history being taught in our educational system. So maybe that's the next thing we need to sort of make good of. But yeah, it just remains for me to say thank you very much.